towards this big picture notion of economic development. We talked a lot in that session about the kinds of activities that an economic development organization in the community should be engaged in. These were the 6 that sort of came through at the top of the discussion that day. We did spend some time thinking about the relative weighting of those. These also kind of formed the basis for some of the discussion at last week's town hall meeting facilitated by Eric Lockhart, where we brought these 6 back to the community to kind of have some input and some feedback around directions there. We built on that in our last session on March 9th by really starting to think about some of the structural questions. As we look at the kind of economic development organization this community needs in the future, we wanted to think about what it should look like and the way it should be built. And I guess we related that structure back to that question of our overall goals and objectives. If we have a broad vision of economic development, then the structure that's created to meet that vision needs to be broad in its focus as well. So it needs to be, we talked about here, but broad enough and flexible enough to effectively address that bigger, more holistic vision. That resonates with some of the comments we heard in some of the presentations earlier this evening from the community as well. That notion of flexibility and needing to sort of be able to tackle that range of issues that are part of the economic development concern. We spent a lot of time last time talking about the structure of the board. Should it be an internal department of the city? Should it be an external arm's length structure? Should it have a board of directors that's appointed one way or another? And I guess the consensus was that the structure of economic development is not the source in the current context of the issues that the community is concerned with. It's not the structure itself. It's not the nature of the organization in the sense of how it's incorporated or how it's been established. But that there are other reasons for that. And so as we think about structures moving forward, we wouldn't necessarily at this point eliminate an external arm's length kind of a structure. In fact, there were some arguments that might continue to be a way to go. We did sort of come to the conclusion in part of that discussion that there needed to be some additional insight and thought about the makeup of the board of directors moving forward. But as we thought about council representation, as we thought about the breadth of the community, we did need to give some thought to how that board in the future might be composed. And then in relationship to that, there might also be a greater array of working groups and committees drawing on membership from across the community to ensure stronger levels of community input into some of the economic development activities in our ideal kind of a structure. So sort of an ideal of leveraging greater levels of community participation, community oversight, community engagement in some of the activities of the organization. So tonight I want to kind of build on some of those things. I mean, that's a very kind of quick, high level kind of look at some of the things we've talked about. You know from some of the notes that there's pages and pages of material that kind of summarizes the more detailed discussions. But tonight I want to look at 3 issues in particular. Performance measurement, that is, how do we actually establish metrics and measures to assess whether or not we're doing a good job in economic development? Accountability and transparency. How do we ensure that the information that we're generating, often through those performance measures or through other activities, is transparent and clear to the community, that we have accountability to our stakeholders and to the community more broadly to sort of live up to expectations? And how do we engage in the question of communications? How do we ensure that we're sort of creating the right structures to share that information with those stakeholders? And I guess no surprise that as we've heard feedback from the community over the last 3 or 4 months, a lot of the issues that have been raised, a lot of the concerns that have been addressed revolve around these issues. You know, questions about whether or not the performance metrics in place are the right ones, whether or not they can be trusted, whether or not the information is always flowing in the right directions. And so we're hearing from the kind of the engagement process that these are key concerns or key questions for the community, and that's why we kind of want to make these a priority for this evening. So in terms of approach, what I'm going to do is tackle these in this order. I do want to take about 15, 20 minutes right at the start to talk about this whole question of performance measurement, because I think having some insight into what other communities are doing and some of the approaches that other communities are following could be helpful. But then that's going to lead into an extended conversation as we kind of wrestle with all 3 of these issues, beginning with performance measurement, but moving into the other cases. Does that seem appropriate? So I wanted to start looking at a quick survey that the Economic Developers Association of Canada did a few years ago of economic development organizations around the channel of measurement. They surveyed 99 communities and asked them to start, what areas of activity is your economic development organization responsible for? We can see that about 84 of the communities, so about 86% of the respondents said, well, we're involved in business attraction or investment attraction. So that was the area of economic development activity that had the highest level of commonality. The interesting thing here is that, if 98 communities answered this question and 84 said they're doing investment attraction, it means there are 14 communities where economic development doesn't do investment attraction, right? So there's not this sort of universal sense of what economic development is and what it's all about. We can also see that as the list goes down, there's quite a range of things that communities are involved in. And so one of the challenges, we'll come back to this notion as we think about performance measurement, is you can't apply a kind of a one-size-fits-all. If everybody's doing something a little bit different, there isn't a kind of an off-the-shelf approach to performance measurement that we can go and take. This survey also asked communities what it is that they're actually measuring currently. So we can see the number one response was the number of new businesses that were opened in the community. Interesting kind of response. So data challenges around this. In most provinces, you can actually get a list of the businesses that opened in your community at the end of every month, but in Ontario, that information is not generally available. The second thing that ranked on this list of what they're measuring is population. Interesting kind of a metric. If the population grows in a community, is that an indicator of what the Economic Development Department did? Interesting to see that this is one of the more common metrics. So it sort of raises interesting questions about what we should look at in this context. We did some work a few years ago, this is in Michael's space actually, for the Workforce Development Boards of Ontario. These are workforce serving organizations where we asked all of the boards in Ontario, do you think that performance measurement is necessary to be able to improve your organization on an ongoing basis? Well, yeah, 100% of the respondents said yes, we need to be able to measure things if we're going to get better. We then asked those same organizations, is there a recognized system for making those performance measurements? And more than 85% came back and said, well no, we know we need this stuff, but we don't actually have a recognized system that we can all use to start to wrestle with this. And we see this challenge. We look at a lot of communities about how they measure economic development. I see a lot of annual reports from economic development departments or agencies where they'll measure, for example, the value of building permits issued in the previous year. Well, what are we really measuring with the value of building permits? How much does that have to do with the economic development of the community, particularly if we think of this broader vision of what economic development is? How much of that building permit activity can be attributed to the work of the Economic Development Department? There's a real challenge in this space around connecting data to the activity that we do in economic development. So a number of challenges as we start to try to wrestle with this. First, the diversity of the work that we do in economic development. We're looking at a whole series of different things, from tourism to supporting small entrepreneurs to attracting investors from overseas. We have a lot of intangibles. We've heard a lot of discussion in the community engagement sessions around we don't want jobs, we want quality jobs. How do we measure a quality job versus a non-quality job? So there are sort of intangibles, and not everything that we're looking at in economic development can be easily quantified. And then this sort of final challenge is the notion of attribution. There's lots of things that we can measure. We can go to StatsCan, we can go to Industry Canada, we can go to all sorts of places. But how do we connect those measures back to what economic development organizations actually do? There are a number of resources that have come together in the last couple of years to help economic development organizations try to figure this out. EDAC, that Economic Developers Association of Canada, published a paper in 2009, updated it in 2011. I think Judith actually circulated that to the committee a few weeks ago. The International Economic Development Council, which is a U.S. organization, published a report called Making It Count back in 2013, which looks at local performance measurement and economic development. But probably the best resource in this space actually comes from the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. They published a handbook called Measuring Up in 2013, which gives tools to communities about how to kind of look at and measure economic development performance. So it's fine that we've kind of got these systems, we understand some of the challenges, but as we think about performance measurement, what is it that we're actually trying to do with our economic development organizations? So Wikipedia suggests that performance measurement is the process of collecting information and data about a group or an organization or a system to see whether outputs are in line with what was intended or should have been achieved. So there's sort of two parts to that. One is we have to collect data. That part's pretty straightforward. There's lots of data out there. But we have to find a way to use that data to decide or determine whether or not we've achieved the objectives that we set out for ourselves. We've got to find a way to link the data back to activity, and that's the problem that really emerges when we start to think about performance measurement. How do we take that abstract idea of get a bunch of information and show what we're doing and link it back to the actual efforts and goals of what we're seeking to achieve in economic development? So when we get into this space, this leads us to kind of develop some terms or language that we want to sort of work with. So on the one hand, we want to talk about how we measure things. We can have measurements or metrics or key performance indicators. But we also need language that talks about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And in most of the reports and studies that I've talked about so far, the language or the term that's used is the notion of outcomes. We can measure activity, we can measure all kinds of input, but what we're really trying to link that to is our desired outcomes. What are the goals of economic development, and how do we collect metrics that tell us about whether or not we're meeting those big goals? So a lot of the standard approach to how to do this revolves around what are known as logic models. The idea is that you can measure all kinds of things going into an organization. The amount of money that goes in, the amount of hours that are spent on doing things, the number of activities that are part of it. But what you're really trying to get a sense is how those things connect to your outcomes, your desired accomplishments or goals at the end of the day. How do you sort of assess whether all those inputs, all those resources that were consumed actually had an effect on the outcomes that you're looking to engage in? So a quick example of how we might do this in an economic development space, we talk about working to support new entrepreneurs, for example. So we may have a whole series of activities around entrepreneurship support. We could say, I have a small business support office, I'm going to run a bunch of seminars to help small business owners or would-be entrepreneurs. So I can actually measure the number of seminars that I held. So if I say I had 13 seminars this year, does that mean I've had economic development success? I don't know. The 13 seminars in and of itself doesn't tell me a whole lot of information. If I say those 13 seminars allowed us to train 164 entrepreneurs, well, there's a little more information there, but I still don't really know about what the impact of all this is. I've got some really interesting metrics to start with. I held 13 sessions, 164 people participated. What did that lead to? What I need to do is take that number of entrepreneurs and start to link it to things like an increase in the business startup rate. Of those 164 entrepreneurs, how many actually launched a new business? And then of those businesses that were launched, how many actually survived, grew, hired employees? And my economic development strategy might say that one of the goals of economic development in my community is job growth. But if I'm just measuring the number of seminars I held, it's really hard to link that to the notion of job growth. The idea behind performance measurement is we create that kind of logic chain between the activities that we do and the things that we're trying to accomplish. This is from the Ministry of Agriculture and Food's handbook around how to build a logic model. You can see these can get fairly complex, but the basic idea is fairly straightforward. It's that this sort of sense of how the inputs and initial activities relate to the things that we're trying to achieve in the longer run. So how have other communities sort of wrestled with this and started to think about ways they can measure their economic development? Here's one of the performance reporting models that used to be used in Ottawa. We can see here, OPRI was the organization at the time. They were measuring a whole series of things, the number of companies within a cluster or a sector of industry, the rate of change in the size of the company, the unemployment rate in the community, property tax assessment base. And what they were doing was saying, if we measure all these things, that'll tell us about what we're doing on the economic development front. Here was the source of the information, here was how often they would measure it. And you can see one of the challenges with this kind of a set of measures is, if the unemployment rate in my community goes up or down, what does that tell me about the work of the economic development organization? Probably not a whole lot in and of itself. The unemployment rate might go up. We're losing jobs in the community. But maybe without the work of the economic development organization, it would have gone up further. There's a sort of a first aid the sense that you're kind of in an emergency or a crisis situation where the local economy is declining, and it would have been a lot worse if the economic development organization hadn't been there. We can look at the contrary side of that as well. We can say the unemployment rate went down, the economy is getting better, there's more jobs. How much credit can the economic development organization take for that? Good question. In and of itself, that data doesn't tell us anything about what that organization's impact on those numbers are. So we see a lot of communities can report a lot of data, We can go to StatsCan and lift something off their website, but it really doesn't tell us a whole lot about the actual performance of what's going on in the community. Here's a bit of a step forward over that kind of model that comes from Halifax, where we could say they sort of modified that approach that Ottawa was using. So they have, very similar kinds of metrics, the population of the community, the participation rate in the labor force, employment growth, and they're kind of measuring these things on an ongoing basis. But they've also assigned targets to these metrics. We want the level of immigration to be X in a few years' time, or we want the employment rate to be Y in a few years' time. And so we measure ourselves in terms of how much progress is being made towards those goals. This does a good job of starting to make you think about those outcomes, but it's still really challenging in terms of connecting the work that the economic developers are doing on a daily basis with the kinds of numbers that you're measuring here. And this challenge of connecting the work to the measures is one of the fundamental challenges of economic development performance measurement. How do we actually find metrics that tell us about the activities and the value of the economic development work versus just measuring a bunch of things about the economy? Perhaps the community that was most able to kind of get at this was Oakville, with something that they developed a few years ago called the OEDA factor, OEDA for Oakville Economic Development Agency. Now, it's a very narrow kind of a model. It only measures the impact of investment attraction activities. But basically what Oakville said was, we have to have some kind of a handle on whether or not we're doing a good job in this space. So why do we do investment attraction? Well, we want to create more jobs, and we want to generate more tax revenues at the local level. So can we come up with a model that allows us to measure those things if that's what we're seeking to do with investment attraction? And the notion was that in any given year, Oakville might attract a whole series of companies. Or over time, they might attract a series of companies, or they might retain those companies, keep them from leaving the community. And then as those companies stayed or moved to the community, they would bring jobs or tax revenues with them. And the notion behind the OEDA factor is that rather than just letting the economic development organization say, we attracted company X, and therefore we'll take credit for the jobs and tax revenues, was to actually hire a third party to contact the company and say, you recently made a decision to move to Oakville. What percentage of your decision to move to Oakville was based in the work of the economic development organization there? And a company might say, well, we weren't planning to go there at all, so 100% of our decision to go to Oakville was based on their work. Or it might say, well, we didn't really have any contact with them at all, so we can't give them credit for our coming here. It was completely independent. The OEDA factor takes the response of the company, assigns a percentage to it, and says, well, if the economic development operation was 75% responsible for the company moving to that community, then the economic development operation, in a sense, can get credit for 75% of the jobs created or 75% of the tax revenues generated. And what that allowed Oakville to do was to sort of do a bit of a kind of a calculation over time to determine whether or not their investment in economic development was appropriate. So the yellow line here represents the kind of the annual budget for Oakville economic development. The blue line represents the kind of the amount of taxes that were sort of arrived at through this calculation. All those companies who said, economic development was responsible for this portion of our decision, applying that against the taxes they were paying by coming to the community. And the red bar adds those taxes together year over year, because once a company comes to a community, it continues to pay taxes on an ongoing basis. There's a cumulative value to that activity. And in Oakville's case, they were able to suggest that although in any given single year, their investment in economic development outweighed the kind of direct tax benefits, that cumulatively, over time, the impact and the benefit of having economic development in place was pretty substantial. Now, we have done this work for a community in one case. This is actually from Sault Ste. Marie. We did some calculations for them going back a decade or so to kind of look at how this works. And I think what we found was that while it's a very tangible, very specific kind of a model of how to do performance measurement, it's also very difficult to work with on an ongoing basis. It's extremely time-consuming. It's not something that can generally be handled easily in-house, particularly if you're trying to get impartiality around the figures. And there's still lots of debate about what those numbers potentially mean. The other side of it is it may be kind of a reasonable tool for measuring investment attraction activity, but how much does it tell you about tourism? Or how much does it tell you about working with small businesses? And so there are kind of individual metrics that we can go to. Communities may decide this is a really good way to measure this part of our activities. But ultimately, Ms. Kekko was done with the development of a dashboard. Ultimately, there's going to need to be a pretty wide range of performance metrics used to kind of capture any sense of what the organization's activities are resulting in. The OEDA model is interesting in the sense that it allows us to kind of very directly attribute the outcomes to the work of the organization, but it's just giving us one very small slice of the bigger picture. So a couple other things that, as we think about performance metrics, to maybe keep in mind are the notions of benchmarking and neutrality. I'll cover these off very quickly, but benchmarking is the notion that we compare our performance against the performance of previous years. So we see this chart here, for example, which comes from Initiatives Prince George, an economic development agency in British Columbia. They have a whole series of indicators that they're measuring. They're looking at how they do the metrics. They're looking at their performance over time, but basically they have benchmarked themselves against a start year. So they want to know not just how well they did this year, but how well they did over the last year in which they were engaged in measuring these activities. We see benchmarking a lot in kind of international development structures. So the United Nations declared the Millennium Development Goals. There's a series of goals that they wanted to achieve by 2015. So for example, one of their goals was to eradicate extreme hunger and poverty. They wanted to cut in half the number of people who live on less than $1.23 to sort of re-up with the funding or the programs that are in place. And so when we think about performance measurement, we often have to think about who the audiences are. We have an internal audience, how do we improve our operations? We have an external audience, how do we build buy-in at the community and show them we're doing the things we said we would do? And how do we get buy-in from our funders and our sort of institutional supporters? I think that suggests two things that we touch on briefly in the background paper that we shared with you, is that the kinds of systems you put in place internally and externally may actually be a little bit different from each other. We've flagged, for example, the model of the balanced scorecard as an example of an